When I visited Karl Marx-Hof, a social housing estate in Vienna, the first thing that struck me was how big it was. It's so huge, I bet it will take this entire video for me to walk from one end to the other. It has 3 tram stops and also shared childcare services and washrooms in its heyday. This was rare for the Viennese working class when it was completed in 1930. Most workers hadn't previously had access to even running water. The second and most important thing that struck me about Karl Marx-Hof was its history. It was part of an ambitious social housing project in Vienna that saw more than 60,000 flats built for approximately 220,000 people between 1919 and 1934. If you have watched my channel before, you'll know I lived in Sydney for a while before leaving, partially due to the insane cost of housing. So I was curious about what Sydney could learn from famously affordable Vienna. What I didn't realise before visiting Karl Marx-Hof was that Vienna's social housing blitz didn't happen in a vacuum. It was part of a broader social democratic movement called Red Vienna.
Wir sind das Bauvolk der kommenden Welt. Wir sind der Sämann, die Saat und das Feld.
Social democracy is a political ideology that, in Red Vienna's time, advocated for a peaceful evolutionary transition of society from capitalism to socialism using established political processes. Although there was a violent civil war against fascists later in the decade, but that's beyond the scope of the video. Socialism itself is a broad political and economic set of beliefs that essentially boil down to the public or cooperative ownership of property and resources as opposed to the private ownership of capitalism, although this is distinct from being able to own personal property. This movement began after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy in 1918, when the Social Democrat Party of Austria won the country's first elections held under universal suffrage. They then began a huge wave of all-encompassing socialist reforms. These included the construction of public libraries, public baths for hygiene, kindergartens where 2/3 of the children were given free places, Europe's first public orphanage, a graduated taxation system, and welfare. But has there ever been democratic socialism in Australia? It's a shame that Australia never had a social democratic government that introduced similar policies. Wait a second. Labor's constitution claims that it is a democratic socialist party with the objective of democratic socialisation of industry, production, distribution and exchange to the extent necessary to eliminate exploitation and other antisocial features in these fields. Now, a brief explanation of the difference between social democracy and democratic socialism is in order. These terms are often used interchangeably, but essentially, social democracy is a liberal democracy with socialist features like unions, welfare, and Medicare, and of course, social housing. Whereas democratic socialism is a planned socialist economy with democratic participation. So really, despite identifying as democratic socialists, the Labour Party was more of a social democratic party as well, but I digress. Labour has been moving further away from both of these ideologies, so the distinction is not super important for this discussion. It's generally agreed that Australia's last true socialist Prime Minister was Ben Chifley, a railway driver from Bathurst, where I live now, who rose to power through union participation. Crucially for our discussion of social housing, he was Prime Minister from 1945 to 1949 during Australia's post-World War II housing crisis. He oversaw the implementation of the Commonwealth Housing Commission, which John Curtin's Labor government had created the year before Curtin died and made Chifley Prime Minister, and the original Commonwealth State Housing Agreement allowed the states to build public housing to be both rented and sold to occupants. A major difference between the original intent of the CSHA and Australia's current social housing model is that the CSHA operated a broader rental model to working and non-working households, i.e. it was far less strictly means-tested. However, our current federal social housing program, the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, only provides housing to the lowest income, highest need applicants. Australia's social housing peaked in the 1970s under the Whitlam government when Labor was transitioning away from socialism. Social housing was 6.5% of the market nationally, which was relatively consistent with Sydney's housing market too. But as of May 2024, social housing now represents just 3.8% of housing in Australia. Waitlists for public housing have increased by 9% since 2020, and homelessness has increased by 36% since 2006. Additionally, the average rental household in Sydney spends more than 30% of its gross before tax income of $123,415 on rent. It's worth noting that the average salary in New South Wales is $95,108. So even with a significant portion of low-income earners clearly being priced out of Sydney, the city's population is still under rental stress. So how has Vienna avoided a housing crisis and the neoliberalisation of its Socialist Party? Vienna rent versus Sydney rent. As of January 2024, a quarter of the people who live in Vienna are social tenants. If you also include cooperative dwellings, buildings owned by a democratically run corporation where the people living there are shareholders, built with municipal subsidies, it's more than half the population. This makes private renters better off too. While in 2021, social housing residents spent 22% of their post-tax income on rent and energy costs, Viennese living in private housing still only spent 26%. Market housing has to compete with non-market housing, when non-market housing makes up a significant portion of the rental stock. So yes, you heard me right. Viennese in private housing spend 26% of their post-tax income on rent and energy, whereas Sydney-siders spend over 30% of their before-tax income on just rent, even as the average income in Sydney is significantly higher than elsewhere in New South Wales. I wish I could find a more direct comparison, but even looking at this, you can tell that that's a huge difference. So how can Sydney be more like Vienna? As you can see, the two most confused countries in pub trivia could not be more different in social housing outcomes. There are many reasons behind this. The city of Vienna is its own state in the Austrian Republic, so it can prioritise more city-centric legislation, whereas Australia's major cities exist in states with large rural areas and affordable small or mid-sized towns that are less likely to prioritise social housing as legislation their MPs want to get through. And as I've discussed with Chifley's Labor Party, Australia's federal government has a large responsibility to provide frameworks, incentives and assistance to the states to build social housing. Socialism was also far more stigmatised over the course of the 20th century in Australia than in much of Europe, so non-market solutions to problems are far less popular here than in many European countries, although we're nowhere near as bad as the US in that respect, thankfully. So in a country where both major parties have proven themselves incapable of building social housing and addressing a housing crisis since the 70s, as outlined in this excellent and infuriating video by Shareth from Building Beautifully, what can we as citizens and voters do? Over the past 30 years, an interesting trend has been brewing that manifested dramatically during our last two federal elections: the increasing influence of minor parties and independents. Labor won the last two elections largely because the coalition lost voters to independents, and some of these independents have much better stances on housing than the major parties. Even though the Teals are characterised as economically liberal, a surprising number have a solid track record on voting for social housing. David Pocock and Zali Steggall, for example, have voted for the federal government to take a larger role in building social housing. And a media release from Kate Hook, who came third in Calais, my electorate, is also more progressive on housing than the major parties, advocating for more social housing, negative gearing and capital gains tax reform, more renter protections, and caps on rent increases. These independents generally have a focus on listening to community members and experts rather than towing a party line. As a voter, you have the potential to have real influence here by meeting with your local independent and discussing what's important for you about solving the housing crisis. If you live in an unaffordable area with an independent MP, chatting with them about social housing could genuinely influence their policy platform. This shift to independence also hasn't happened on the state level to the degree it has federally, so researching your independent candidates during your next state election would be a good move too. There's also the Greens, the only party of decent size advocating for huge increases in social housing. One of their stances is that the government should require that at least 10% of all dwellings in New South Wales must be public and not-for-profit social housing, which is less than half of Vienna's social housing stock, but would be record-breaking for Australia. In the meantime, consider your own position within the housing market. Are you able to join or start a cooperative? Can you donate or volunteer for a non-profit that builds or manages affordable housing? They're small moves, but normalising alternatives to market housing is important. Being a YIMBY can help too. Whenever new housing, especially social or not-for-profit housing, is proposed, voice your support of it to overpower the voices of the privileged NIMBY class who are trying to keep their property values climbing. But, just like with Red Vienna, we do need a significant change in government to change the status quo. Luckily, one is happening. It's been incremental rather than an all-out revolution, but we've been facing incremental problems rather than something as instant and catastrophic as the collapse of one of Europe's great powers after the biggest war the continent had ever seen. I mean, the housing crisis has worsened bit by bit. It's been slowly sneaking up on us. But if we continue to change the political landscape of Australia to rise to meet these challenges, we can hope that when people mix up Austria and Australia, it's not just because of the similar names, but because Australia too provides beautiful and dignified housing for all of its citizens, just like Austria did with estates like Karl Marx-Hof. This has been Footpaths and Corner Stores. My real full name is Christopher, and make sure to subscribe for free access to your choice of the Workers' Temperance League, the Workers' Esperanto Group, or even the Workers' Stenographers Organisation. Pretty tempting. And of course, before we wrap things up, I'd like to take a moment to give a huge thank you to my Ko-fi supporters, who are actually the people who partially funded this trip to Europe and allowed me to buy a 360 camera for it. So huge thank you to Jake Coppinger, Transportist, Zach, Alexander, Lucas, Stuart, Abiram, Michael, Trisha, Shareth, Joe, Ben, and Adam.